So now we're into part 3 of our lecture in the 1920s through 1945, and it's the New Deal. From our last set of notes, we had talked about the onset of the Great Depression and how Herbert Hoover had tried, probably more than any other president before him, to fix America during a recession or depression, but he was limited with his self-help ideology, that he was willing to loan Americans money, but he wasn't willing to give them the amount of help and the grants that they needed to get out of this very severe economic downturn. So now, part 3 is all about the new, Roman numeral 3 is all about the New Deal, and we'll have these lectures in 2 parts. So we're going to start off with part 1, the election of 1932. In 1932, the Republicans renominate, not very enthusiastically, but they renominate Herbert Hoover. There was simply just not that many people who wanted to be president in the Republican Party. The economy was bad. It didn't look like Herbert Hoover had much of a chance at all at getting reelected. The platform that he wants to continue to run on, and remember the Depression has been getting worse and worse and worse every year since 1929, is he still believes in his self-help ideology. He says the United States government can take a role in helping people get out of the Depression, but it shouldn't just give handouts. We shouldn't just give money and jobs to people because it'll ruin their character, their rugged individualism that made America great. Next, he says that we need to still have high tariffs to force Americans to buy American goods, which you remember from our last lecture, didn't really have a positive effect on the U.S. economy and certainly didn't have a positive effect on world trade. And he wants to continue the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, loaning money out to businesses and banks for them to try to stimulate jobs, even though a lot of these businesses and banks decided that is just not what they wanted. The Democrats, they nominate Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, FDR had run for the vice presidency in 1920, not very successfully, and so he is now running again. And so America really would have perhaps elected anybody who was a member of the other party. They are so unhappy with Hoover. And so his platform, he says, the country needs... Excuse my bad FDR accent, but the country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. Above all, try something. That's kind of what he sounded like. But the point of this quote is that Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't really have a plan for getting out of the Depression. He certainly wasn't going to share it with America and commit himself before he gets elected. He just knew that Americans wanted somebody to look like they were doing something. And so that's his plan to get out of the Depression, as simple as that. He just keeps trying things until something works. And so he promises the United States that there'll be a new deal for the American people, which is reminiscent of his fifth cousin, Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal. And he did it on purpose because it's bringing back memories of a Roosevelt that everybody liked in America, that was very popular, and so he's trying to play on that popularity a little bit by promising people a new deal, which basically means the government is going to return to progressivism. The government is going to try to fix society's problems. But the one thing he won't do is he is worried about having the United States fall too much into debt. And we forget about this as Americans because of what will happen later on in FDR's term. But when he was running for the presidency in 1932, there really isn't that much different between him and Hoover. They both believe in rugged individualism to some extent, and they both are business conservatives. They don't want America to go into huge amounts of debt, and they don't believe that the government should do that. So FDR is promising progressivism, but he doesn't believe that we should have huge government programs because he's nervous of what that will do to the economy in the long run if we go too much into debt. So he is going to spend, and we're going to see how much he does spend in his first term, but he's always going to be nervous about the United States government spending too much. And so up until 1932, it was considered not appropriate for the presidential nominee, the party's nominee, to come to the party convention and accept the nomination. It seemed like it was too greedy, like they were too power hungry. But FDR changes that tradition. So when he actually came and accepted the nomination of his party to run for the presidency in 92, and he says, "Let it be symbolic that I broke traditions. Republican leaders not only failed in material things, they failed in national vision. Because in disaster they have held out no hope. I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people." So again, bad accent. But what he is saying is really FDR's message is a message of hope. He tries to tell people that if you vote for him, he's not going to tell you how he's going to do it, but he's going to tell you that he is going to be trying for you. And the perception among Americans that Hoover wasn't, especially the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, it was millions of dollars of loans for big corporations, but not for common people. And so Americans are upset with Hoover, and they think anybody that's promising any change, they're going to believe him. And that was really FDR's greatest strength, is his personality. His ability to connect and communicate with people and promise them things. Maybe not have the best ideas in the world, but to certainly inspire people. There's often been a quote to kind of describe FDR is that he had a second-rate intellect, but a first-rate personality. Whenever he walked into a room or went into a room, people would just connect with him. And so he may not have the best ideas. He certainly, the New Deal, as we're going to see, is not a comprehensive plan to get out of the Depression. But it doesn't matter. Perception is reality. People perceive that he has a plan. They perceive that he's going to give them hope. And so that's what makes him so beloved by the American people. So if we can see here the returns of the election, obviously it's a landslide for the Democrats. Once we see the Solid South is back in the Democratic Party. They did flirt with the Republicans during the Hoover election. You remember Hoovercrats, because they didn't like Al Smith. But we see that even farmers now, which usually vote Republican, they have decided to leave the Republican Party for now and vote Democrat. For the simple reason is that we didn't see Hoover really help farmers all that much. He did offer them low-interest loans, but farmers don't want that. They don't want more loans. And so we see this is a big, huge victory for the Democrats in 1932. America is obviously in want of change. And we see the political pendulum switch back here. If you remember, in the Gilded Age, it was all about business. They wanted laissez-faire, government out of our affairs. And then in the Progressive Age, we look to the government to fix things, to make things better. And then in the 1920s, we go back to being a very laissez-faire, government hands-off kind of thing. And now the political pendulum is switching again, so we want to return to progressivism, really. We're going to see that all of these things that FDR does, it's all about the United States government leading the way, fixing society, solving our problems. And that's modern liberalism, that's progressivism. So the very first 100 days of FDR's administration, when he takes power, is going to be known for just how much, the sheer quantity of legislation that is passed in 100 days. As modern Americans, we find this hard to believe because Congress now seems mired in partisan politics. They certainly have a tough time passing legislation, but that was not the case for FDR. America was demanding that their government take action. So we have a Democratic president with a Democratic Congress, and he is going to be able to pass landmark legislation left and right in his first 100 days. So before we get into all the legislation he passes, let's talk about the transition to power. If you remember, election is in November of 1932, but the new president, FDR, is not supposed to take over office until March 4th, 1933. And that's a 4-month period or so where we see that the outgoing president is known as a lame duck president because people don't want him anymore. He can't, quote-unquote, fly. And the incoming president can't do anything because he's not president anymore. And we see that during this time, from 1932, December to January of 33, February, and then finally March, America slips further and further and further into depression, and the United States government can't or won't do anything to fix it because we have an outgoing president that's upset that nobody wants him anymore. We have an incoming president who can't do anything yet. And so this is really the depths of the depression, this period between this transition. And it's going to leave a lasting imprint on Americans, and eventually we will change the Constitution, the 20th Amendment, to shorten that time period, to make it so that presidents don't have to wait as long to take office. And so here we see a cover of the New Yorker magazine. Hoover is very sour. He's upset that America doesn't like him anymore, and FDR is all smiles. And again, I told you that FDR really, his strength is selling hope. Americans are hopeful again that their government is going to fix things, and we can all start getting jobs again. So in his inaugural address, one of the most famous inaugural addresses in American history, he promises Americans, he's trying to make them feel better. He's trying to bring hope. And he says, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. So here he's just saying, look, there's nothing that can stop us. We're America. We can do anything we want. Just don't be afraid of it. We can move into advance, right? And I won't continue the bad accent, but he says, I shall ask Congress for the remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power as to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given me if I were to, in fact, to invaded by a foreign foe. He is saying that he is going to wage a war on the Depression. He is going to attack it head on. No just messing around. No, maybe I'll do this, maybe I won't. Like I said, in the 100 days, he's going to pass legislation after legislation after legislation as if this was a war and America is being invaded. So Americans have real hope that FDR can do something to help their lives. So next up, the very first thing he does is he gets to the heart of the Great Depression, banking and investment. When Americans in 1920s had put their life savings in banks, they thought it was safe, that it would always be good, but a lot of the banks invested in the stock market, and so when the stock market crashed, all of those life savings disappeared along with it. And so we see people do not trust banks. They believe that if they put their money in a bank, the bank is going to squander it and they're going to lose their whole life savings. And so people were literally putting their monies in coffee cans and burying it in their backyard or hiding in their mattress or holding on to it. And so whatever money people did have, they would hold on to. Who can blame them if you're worried about where your next meal is going to come from? And they wouldn't put it in banks. And if we go all the way back to Hamilton, we know the importance of banks in America. Banks stimulate the economy. You need people to believe in banks. If you put your money in a bank, then that bank will loan it out to start new businesses, creating more jobs. It's a catalyst for the economy, but people didn't trust banks. As we look at this chart here, the number of bank failures that goes in 1933 is 4,000 in America in just 1 year. And when each one of those 4,004 banks fail, it's people's retirement savings, their college savings, their mortgage payments for their homes. It's real hardship for Americans. And then if we look at this dramatic drop from 1933 to 1934, we only have 57 bank failures, and by the end of World War II, we have none. So how does FDR get people to once again trust banks? Because that's really what he has to do first thing. If we're going to get the economy going, we have to have banks, and they have to have money that they can loan out and invest. So the first thing he does is he declares a bank holiday. Now, he took office on March 4th, and so it's just 2 days later, he gets the United States Congress to pass a bill that has all the banks in America shut down for a period of about 4 or 5 days. And this bank holiday, or when the banks shut down, the federal government is going to inspect all of these remaining banks that are still open, their books, and they're going to make a pledge to the American people that they will only let banks open up that have the U.S. government seal of approval. Once we shut that bank down and we look at its records and finances, if it looks like it's a good, solid bank that's going to protect your money, the government says, here's our seal of approval, it can reopen. If the bank is bad, the government will not let that bank reopen, and they will tell all of the people who may have banked in that bank that this is a bad investment, put your money someplace else. And so when the banks open up again, people feel hopeful and assured, and they trust FDR that the banks are now solid, they're firm. And so people start to pour money back into banks. This helps the economy to some degree because now we have a place to go if you want to start up a new business. You can get a loan because banks are opening their doors again. The next thing we have, that's called, by the way, the Emergency Banking Act. So we close the banks down, and the Emergency Banking Act will open them up with the government seal of approval. The next thing we have is the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, another landmark piece of legislation. What it is going to do, it is going to do two things. First of all, it's going to create the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. What that means is if you put your money in a bank, one of these banks that the government says, you got our seal of approval, it's a good bank. Even if the unthinkable happens and the bank loses all of its money, you as just mom and pop, as a regular person who uses the bank, will not lose your money. The bank may go bankrupt, but you won't. Because the United States government will insure your deposits up to $5,000, which was about the price of a house at that point, maybe even a little bit more in some areas. And so that was a lot of money. And so this gives people confidence in banks because it's backed by the government. If your bank goes bankrupt, no worries, you're still going to get your money back. So why wouldn't you put your money in a bank? Now it's a lot safer than in that coffee can buried in your backyard. And so we see people start to, again, pour money back into banks. The other thing it does to restore confidence in banking is that it's going to make a new law that says that your local bank, your U.S. bank, your Wells Fargo, your First Bank, whatever, the bank that you do your commercial banking in and you have your savings account, whatever, it cannot invest in the stock market. We have this thing called commercial banking, and they can only take your money that you put in there and invest it in very low risk investments. It may be bonds or treasury bills or whatever, something that's not likely to lose their money. No more investing in the stock market. Again, this gives you confidence that if I put my money in a bank, it's going to be safe because they're not risking it and gambling on the stock market. However, if you want to have your bank give you higher returns on your investment, then you can go into a special thing called an investment bank. And an investment bank does invest in the stock market. And so we have two kinds of banks now instead of just one. And this is a big deal because now the customers, the consumers, know their risks. If you want to have low risk, low return, and you want to be safe about your money, put it in a commercial bank. If you're okay with a little risk, then you can put it in an investment bank, but know going you may lose it. And so by separating the banks out here, really all of these things on this slide, we see that it's all designed to give people confidence in their banking system again, so they will put their money back in banks. Next, we get the Federal Securities Act, which is designed to regulate the stock market, to clean it up. If you remember in the 1920s, it's like in the Gilded Age, companies could water their stock. They could lie to their investors about how good the company is doing, what kind of profits they've had. But now no more. You have to have full disclosure. And so if you want to go and buy a stock from a company, they have to tell you accurately what is going on, the good and the bad. And so once again, just like all the banking reforms, this is going to give people back confidence in the stock market. Look, it is a little bit safer now to invest in the stock market because you know that the companies you've investigated, the companies you've invested in are telling you the truth, what their profits and losses are. And so this is all about restoring confidence in the financial system. Next, he also will order the United States off the gold standard. This gives him the flexibility to meet this crisis. In the past, as we've talked about before, the U.S. was on the gold standard. So the United States could only print as many dollars as our government had on reserve in a vault somewhere. And so if we have $500 million in gold, we can have $500 million in paper money, not a dime more. But during this crisis, of course, a lot of people cannot pay off their debts. They cannot pay off their loans. Money is too scarce. So we have deflation. Even if I have just a $100 loan, who can find $100? Nobody has a job. And so we see the amount of money has shrunk, and American debtors, as we talked about in the Gilded Age, they want to have a little bit of inflation. And so to free up the government so that they can start to deal with this crisis, he takes us off the gold standard. So what it basically says is that the United States government can now print a lot more money than we actually have in gold reserves. Now this is dangerous. It may cause out of control inflation, but FDR thinks that if we do this a little bit at a time, it's going to help give the government the flexibility to cause a little bit of inflation to counteract that deflation. So now let's move on to employment. So he does, of course, deal with banking and finance first, but the second things he does is he tries to get people back to work again. And now if you remember, Herbert Hoover did some large public works projects, most famously the Hoover Dam, and he did try to loan money out to the states and to businesses for them to put people back to work. But all of these things, except for the Hoover Dam, all of those things we talked about in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, they were all loans, and we said that states or businesses didn't want more loans. And people are starving today. People are starving now. And so FDR decides that the government has to do something about this. He's a progressive. And so what he says, he creates a whole series of programs that's going to put people back to work now. As long as they get some money in their bank account, as long as they get a paycheck, they can buy food for their families. And so the first thing we have is the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. A lot of these are known by their acronyms. And what it does, as you can see in the picture, we're going to take a bunch of out-of-work young men, that's primarily who it was targeted to, young white men, and we're going to get them off the streets. We're going to get them off the bread lines, and we're going to send them out into the forest, and they're going to repair repair or build trails in our nation's parks, work on flood control. They're going to do things out in nature that will benefit all of society in the long run. But the main point of it is that we're going to give a paycheck to these young men. And they're going to live in kind of military-style camps. And they are going to be out there kind of camping in the woods, fixing our open spaces. But the main thing is that they're going to have money. So they're going to be able to eat. And so also they're required to send some of that home to their families, since these are young men, probably their mom and dad. And so now we're helping a whole group of people, not just this young man. However, we do see some African Americans employed by the CCC, but they're in much smaller numbers, and they have to be in segregated camps. And so there are historians that have been critical of FDR, saying that he didn't do enough to help African Americans, and certainly a lot of his programs are geared towards white Americans. But on the other side of the coin, there weren't that many times in American history where the government has helped African Americans at all, and so this is a start, perhaps. We haven't seen the African Americans be helped by the federal government in any significant way, really, since we were talking about the Reconstruction era. And so we see that African Americans could have been helped more by the New Deal, but they are going to have some jobs in some of these places. They are segregated camps, and they're not hired as many numbers, but FDR is doing some things to help minorities during the Depression. Next, he's going to create the Federal Emergency Relief Act, or FERA, and this is very similar to Hoover's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, right? The federal government is going to give money to states, and then the states, what they'll do is they will then create public works projects to put people back to work. The big difference here, though, is that Hoover didn't give out the money, he loaned out the money, and a lot of the states said, no, we have already in debt, we don't want any more loans. But this is a grant. Right? This means that it's just free money. So the federal government will go to all of the states and say, look, here's some money. You don't have to pay it back. Take it. And the states will take the money, and they have their choice under FERA. They can either create what's called make-work jobs. It's really just made-up jobs to give people money, and so they don't feel like they're just begging. And so a typical FERA job for these state make-work jobs may be, here is a stick with a nail on the end of it. Go through all our parks and pick up all the cigarette butts. Or, maybe we need a ditch dug or something like that. Maybe we don't really need these things done, but people feel better if they work for what they earn. It makes them feel like they're not so much in poverty, that they're not just trying to get a handout. And so a lot of states did these make-work jobs. And again, it's just giving people money for a small job so that they can feed their families. Other states just said, well, that's just nonsense. We don't need these make-work jobs. And so they just handed out the money. It's called the dole. Being on the dole. The government just comes and says, look, we know you don't have enough money to feed your kids, pay your electric bill. Here's $50. Do what you need to with it. So it's a very controversial program. Conservatives in America, again, thought that this was ruining people's work ethic. They thought that the government is going to ruin the whole generation of people because they'll look to the government to solve their problems and they'll just sit and collect a paycheck. And so that's kind of the conservative response to the New Deal programs. But for the Democrats, the liberals, the progressives, they say, look, what we're doing is we're trying to get people through the Depression so they can eat, so they don't starve. And so we see two different ways of interpreting the New Deal. Next, we get something called the PWA, or the Public Works Administration. And just like its name implies, this is going to build large public works. Just like Hoover built the Hoover Dam, now we have the United States government engaging in the same type of thing, but on a much bigger scale than the Hoover Dam. Not just one dam here or there, but all across America. And so Americans will be working for the federal government in the PWA, and they will be building thousands of miles of roads, and hundreds of new bridges and hospitals and schools. These are large public works jobs, and this is going to put thousands of Americans back to work. And again, the thinking goes here is that if we can get people back to work, they can feed their families. It might even open up factories again because we're creating consumers. That's not going to happen, but that's the idea. Then we have the Civilian Works Administration, or the CWA, very similar to the other two things that are on this slide, the CCC and the PWA. it is just to create jobs. But this one is very temporary. It only lasts for the winter of 33, basically, and it's temporary make work jobs. And I chose this picture because it's only going to last for a little while, just to get people through the winter. And we could have a dump truck. These people are moving dirt for a road, and we could have a dump truck do this and do it in a fraction of the time. But that's not the point of this program. The point of this program is not really to build roads. The point of this program is to put as many people to work as possible so that they can feed their families. And so that's why we see hundreds of wheelbarrows instead of one dump truck. Next, farmers. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, is passed. Now, we did see Hoover try to give low-interest loans to farmers, but that wasn't it was helpful. And so what we're going to see with the AAA is that once again we're going to try the loan approach, but banks are going to be more willing to loan farmers money because the government is going to back the loans. In other words, the government goes to a farmer and says, hey, why don't you take out a loan? And the farmer said, look, even if I wanted to, I have nothing for collateral. I have nothing to put up in case I can't pay the loan back. And so the United States government says, don't worry about it, we got you. And so if you default on the loan, we'll pay the default for you. And so this is going to make banks more willing to give loans to farmers. Now, again, farmers aren't all that excited about loans, but it does more than that. The AAA also will go beyond what Hoover did, and it's going to tell farmers not to farm. And so, remember, the problem with farmers, even in the 1920s and in the Gilded Age, was there's too much of a surplus. We're just growing too much food. And so, what the federal government is going to do is they're going to tell farmers, look, you 50 farmers, you grow your wheat, and you 50 farmers, you guys don't plant anything this year. And we are going to pay you to do nothing. Now, this may seem weird, but they're going to pay farmers not to farm because that will shrink the surplus. If only a fraction of the farmers are continuing to farm, there'll be less food out there, and so farm prices will go up. And so we see that we still have this today at times. We see in America that farmers are paid to just let their land go fallow, just don't farm. Now, this is very controversial, and it shows you the kind of haphazard approach that the New Deal takes, because we have people in cities who can't afford food, and because they don't have a job, and so they're starving to death. And then here comes the federal government, and in the countryside, they say, why don't you guys plow under your crops? Why don't you slaughter your pigs? Don't plant any more food, and we'll pay you not to plant food, to make farm prices go up. So in the city, we have people who can't afford cheap food, and now the government is saying food should be more expensive. But FDR is not concerned about this because he says, well, we'll just create another program. In this way, we can kind of think of it, I hope this is a good analogy, the New Deal, all of these programs that FDR is trying to use to fix the Depression, it's kind of like the spaghetti approach. There is no overall plan. You just take a bunch of legislation, our spaghetti noodles, and you throw it up on the wall and you see what sticks. If it's a good program, it stays, we keep it. If it's a bad program and it falls, we just get rid of it, replace it with a new one. And so this is a very kind of haphazard, contradictory approach to trying to fix the Depression. And it really isn't going to work. We're not going to see America get out of the Depression because of the New Deal. But what we are going to see is people are not going to be starving to death. We're going to see that they're going to have hope and faith in the government because they see the government trying. And they do see that they have some money now coming in because of these construction programs or the AAA to help them get through these tough times. Next, the AAA, here's another example of it not being one easy fix for everything. It does help white farmers because now they're getting fewer surplus in the market, and so their farm prices are going up. But it also is going to hurt African American farmers. Down south, a lot of the people who own the land were plantation owners who had cotton, and who worked the land, of course, for them was the African Americans who were sharecroppers. And so we see African Americans don't own any land, and so when the government comes to the farmer who owns the plantation, he says, don't grow any cotton, we have too much cotton, it's lowering the prices, then the cotton plantation owner will take the federal money, and then he'll lay off all his sharecroppers. And so that may be good for the plantation owner, but it's certainly not good for the African American sharecropper. And so we see that the AAA actually hurts African Americans, but then again the CCC is giving some African Americans jobs in one of those CCC camps. So and again, it's this very let's just try everything approach, no overall plan. Now, how do we pay for all of this? And this was a problem for FDR. He knows that he doesn't want to go too far into debt because he's afraid of the effect it'll have on the economy if the United States government goes way into debt. And so he says, well, we have to pay for this. And so to pay for all of this money that we're giving for farmers not to farm, where is he going to get that money? And so he puts a processing tax on food. In other words, if you, let's say you're a chicken farmer and you cut up the chickens and process them and send them out to the customers, there is a tax for the processing of the food, and that's how we're going to pay farmers not to farm. Well, once again, this is problematic. It's counterproductive because now this is going to make food prices go up. In addition to being scarcity making food prices go up, now there's going to be food prices because we have a tax. And so we see, again, in the countryside, it's good for farmers. In the city, oh my gosh, these people cannot afford to pay for the food. But that's okay. FDR said we'll just have another program. We'll create the PWA, the WPA, the CCC. We'll create all these make-work programs. And so now people can afford. And so once again, no overall plan, but it is putting food on people's tables. The Supreme Court is eventually going to say that the AAA is unconstitutional. And this is a thing we're going to see again and again and again in FDR's first term, is he's going to try all these progressive ideas. He's going to have the government try to fix things. Some of them work, some of them don't work. But there is a conservative Supreme Court. If you remember, Herbert Hoover appointed 4 Supreme Court justices, and they are conservative. They don't like the government getting bigger. They don't like these progressive reforms. And so the Supreme Court is going to try to combat the New Deal because they think it's too liberal. It's too much in businesses' affairs. It's hurting rugged individualism. And so the U.S. Supreme Court will strike a lot of these pieces of legislation down as unconstitutional. They did this one because we see that some of these farms that are getting taxed, or these food processors, they are just selling their goods inside their own state. And we don't necessarily need to know this, but it's an example that Congress only has the power to tax if we see interstate trade, not intrastate trade. In any event, the Supreme Court will strike the AAA down as being unconstitutional, so it's an example of the Supreme Court conservatives fighting the New Deal. So next up we have FDR in business. So we've talked about banking, we've talked about farming, let's talk about how he deals with business people. And so FDR starts his administration somewhat conservative. Again, more conservative than people think. FDR, in the start, he doesn't want the United States government to be socialistic. He doesn't want us to go over and take over businesses. He wants us to work with businesses, as we see in this picture, or this diagram. And so he creates the National Recovery Administration, or also known as the NRA. Don't confuse it with the National Rifle Association of today. The NRA has a blue Thunderbird as its symbol. You can see this Thunderbird on this picture. It's not blue because it's black and white, but it was. And everybody who believed in the NRA, who was supporting the New Deal, would put this on display in their shop, in their factory, in their home, whatever. It was a sign that we're all in this together. And so what the NRA does is it creates kind of like Hoover's associationalism. It's creating a trust of sorts. So this is somewhat conservative. It says that big businesses, what you should do is you should agree to not compete anymore. Because if you compete, then what you're going to do is you're going to drive other factories out of business, creating more unemployment. And so FDR and the United States government tries to get businesses to work together so that they can keep their profits kind of high without laying off workers. And again, this is a pool or a trust. And so we see FDR is certainly not the trust buster that Teddy Roosevelt was. And so, besides just production prices, he says that some of these codes of conduct, things that businesses will agree to, is they'll agree to give their workers a certain minimum wage, or they'll agree to give their workers certain hours. We can see the benefit of this because if all of these factories that are part of the NRA do this, then we're going to see that they won't be cutting workers' wages, they won't be cutting workers' hours, and so the workers have a chance to continue to take home a paycheck. Also, we talked about them doing production amounts and quality and price. Again, it's businesses working together to make the Depression less impactful and also not drive out their competitors out of business. He also goes to the unions. So FDR is going to go to the union and say, look, businesses bought into this. Would you guys can organize, you can become a union, but please don't strike. If you go on strike, that's going to cause labor unrest. You're going to get laid off, and the last thing we need is more people to be laid off. And so he's trying to get employees and employers all working together for the benefit of the common good. Of course, it fails. It fails because the Depression is just too bad. If you're a union, you might say, okay, I understand what you're going for here, FDR, but I don't trust those owners, and I know they're going to try to cut wages. Doesn't matter what the codes of conduct you passed are, and so we see unions will go on strike. Then we also see businesses not trust their workers, and they don't trust each other. If I'm a business, my whole nature is to compete and to make money, and so if we have business A and business B competing in the same industry, they both quote-unquote signed the codes of conduct. Well, if I'm business A, I still want to drive business B out of business, so I'm going to lower my prices. I'm going to cheat. And so, of course, then business B will too. It was really hard at this time to try to get people to voluntarily give up competition in the business world, because that's what businesses do. It's hard to get unions to give up strikes because that's the reason for unions, to get better conditions for their workers. And so this voluntary effort just fails. So this is a great example of how at the start of his administration, FDR is not going to be as liberal or as progressive as he ultimately will become. He has hopes that we can get out of the Depression without becoming too liberal or too progressive. Eventually, the NRA will be declared unconstitutional, and the Schechter versus Poultry Corp. The Supreme Court once again will say they're once again trying to fight the New Deal programs. They don't like the United States government getting involved in the business community. They're 1920s business conservatives on the Supreme Court, and so we see now twice that the Supreme Court has struck down New Deal ideas. And so we have our last category for Section B, miscellaneous. These are just a whole bunch of pieces of legislation that I couldn't put in business or I couldn't put in farmers, but they are important nonetheless. So one of the programs we have is the HOLC, or the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and it's going to help people who own homes to refinance their mortgages. Now, even though it's kind of Hoover-esque because it's a loan, if I'm in the Depression and I've lost my job or I've had my wages cut, it's really hard to keep paying my mortgage to keep my family housed. And so what this does is the government goes to banks and they said, just like for farmers, we're going to back some of these loans. So they say to businesses, look, let people refinance their mortgages, give them a lower rate, allow them to drop their monthly payments so they can hold on to their home. And if they go into foreclosure, the United States government's going to cover your losses, banks, don't worry about it. And so banks were willing to give people lower interest loans. In addition, the Homeowners Loan Corporation is going to actually get in the home building business. They're going to build thousands of low-rent homes for people that they can afford to rent. The main thing is we don't want people on the streets homeless. Homeless people not only suffer because they're homeless, but if you are in a home, you stimulate the economy. Homeowners buy lawnmowers, homeowners buy dishwashers, homeowners, buy home repair things, tiles and things. And so the housing industry stimulates a whole bunch of other industries. And if people are renting, they're not going to be doing all of those things. And so we see it was very important for FDR to get people to stay in their homes for the nation's health, but also to stimulate the economy. Next, we are going to have the beer tax. Now, Prohibition dies very quickly after FDR gets elected. Now we have the 21st Amendment, which repeals the 18th Amendment. So what it basically says, the 21st Amendment, is that now alcohol is legal again. And we do this because, one, Prohibition was very unpopular and not very successful. But two, is that if we have people buying beer, we can tax them. And remember, FDR doesn't want the government to go into debt too much for paying for all of these programs that he's created. And this will allow the United States government to get some revenue back in, some money back in, so we don't go too far into debt. And so we see the beer tax. And so we are raising taxes, FDR is, on people who want to pay for beer. And so again, this is something that we wouldn't normally think of when we talk about the progressive ideas, is raising taxes on people. Next, we get the Tennessee Valley Association or Authority. It is a huge public works project. It is going to dam up the rivers in Tennessee. If you look at this map here, really most of Tennessee and some surrounding states are going to be involved in this project. We're going to build all those dams that you can see on the map, putting thousands of people back to work. If you remember, this was proposed earlier in Hoover's administration as the Muscle Shoals bill, and he vetoed it because he said that it's too big of a project. The United States is going to go into debt, and it's socialism, because the government is going to own these dams. They're hydroelectric dams, and the government is then going to be selling electricity to the consumer really cheaply. And so private electric companies will go out of business because the government can provide it cheaper. But FDR does not veto this because he's a little bit more liberal and progressive than Hoover does, and so we see this program, and it puts thousands upon thousands of people back to work, but it also gives consumers really cheap electric prices. So this is section C. It'll be our last section we're going to do in this part of our notes. So it says rivals of FDR. The main thing, before I start talking about Father Charles Coughlin, is the main idea for these next three slides. As FDR goes through his first term, the Depression is not going away. And people they're starting to get angry. Kind of the honeymoon with FDR is over. People said, look, you gave us hope, you made us promises that the economy is going to get better, and it isn't. And so we see that there are certain critics of FDR that come about, and these critics, here's the big picture, the big thing to take away. These critics are going to be very popular among the people. They're going to become political challengers to FDR, and he understands that he is not going to win re-election if the economy doesn't get better, and it looks like he's doing more. And so to win re-election, FDR is going to become more and more liberal. He's going to be more progressive. The government is going to go into debt. He finally realizes that I have to go into debt to solve this depression. And one of the things that makes him make this realization is all of these political rivals that pop up, they could become the next president. And so FDR is pushed to become more liberal than he was when he first started to try to fix our nation's problems. And so the first of these rivals we're going to talk about is Father Charles Coughlin. At the start, he's a big supporter of FDR. He sees FDR as trying to help the people who are in America who are suffering. And so Father Charles Coughlin is not just your ordinary Catholic priest. He is a radio evangelist. Which means he is an evangelist who's on the radio, and he has millions of people who listen to his Sunday program every week. And he starts out supporting FDR, but then when the Depression doesn't get better, he starts attacking FDR, and he says FDR needs to do more. And then as time goes on, he starts to look for people to blame for our Depression, and so he becomes very anti-Semitic in his speeches, anti-immigrant to some extent, and so he certainly becomes a figure that is looking for a scapegoat, and he is very critical of FDR, and so FDR realizes he's got to fix the situation because he doesn't want all these people following Father Charles Coughlin. The next one we have is Dr. Francis Townsend. As you can see in the picture, he's an older gentleman, and Dr. Francis Townsend comes up with something that he thinks will end the Depression. And he believes that if the United States government gives $200 a month to every old person in America, it'll solve the Depression. Now, it kind of sounds like a harebrained scheme, and it really is. But his thinking goes that if America gives the old people in America, retired people, $200 a month, one, we keep them from starving to death and being evicted from their homes, and two, as part of the $200 a month plan, all the old people have to spend it now. They have to spend it immediately. So that means people will be consuming again, which will reverse the downward spiral of the economy, open up factories, creating more consumers, creating more factories, creating more consumers. And so we see that this is his plan. Now, that's obviously very popular with retired people, but it just wouldn't make sense economically. The United States government didn't have that much money to give to all of the retired people in America. The next one we have is probably the biggest threat to FDR. It's Governor Huey P. Long. He is the governor of Louisiana, and later he'll serve in the United States Senate, and he comes up with something called the Share Our Wealth Plan. Now, Huey P. Long is a political machine boss. He controls politics in the state of Louisiana, and he came up with this plan, and it's very populist. It's very going to be appealing to the common man, his Share Our Wealth plan. He says what we're going to do is we're going to take all the money from the rich people in America and we're going to redistribute it to the poor. He promises every poor person in America who's out of work $5,000 that was taken from the rich. Now, again, this is very radical. This is very communistic in a sense, and also it's very popular with the poor people. You can understand why they might like him and vote for him. So he keeps criticizing FDR. He says, "Look, the people in Louisiana are starving to death, and you're not doing anything about it." And he was thinking about running for the presidency in 1936. And because of this, FDR realizes he has to get more aggressive. He has to get more assertive in trying to end the Depression. And so he's going to do more after the first 100 days to try to get people back to work. Now, Huey P. Long doesn't run for the presidency in 1936. He's going to be assassinated on the steps of the State House in Louisiana, ending that political threat for FDR. But the overall idea is important, that all of these rivals of FDR, like I said before, are pushing him to be more liberal, to be more active in trying to end the Depression. When we come back, we'll talk about what is sometimes called the Second New Deal. Things that FDR will try to do to end the Depression that's even more forceful than what he has done previously.